So one thing that is very striking about having an exhibition like this in a place like this is one of the points that you've mentioned in your curatorial intent is how the space of a studio or the atelier ends up being this white box, which is often male dominated. And the fact that this particular building where we are sitting right now has lived a life as a residential house, I think that paradox is very interesting to see how we are bringing voices of women practitioners and how they bring their personal lives into this building, which served as a house at one point. So let's talk about how the exhibition has incorporated the oral history project. And Sanghamitra and I were talking about it before you got here. And we, of course, both experienced the exhibition in a very different way because as an architect, when I came into the space, I was very familiar with the women and their work. What I did not know was the story behind it. So for me, it was the oral histories kind of filled in the blanks and gave me context to the work and how the work came out to be. Whereas Sanghamitra looked at it in a very, very different way. And we were talking about the role of curator and narrative making in putting together an exhibition which emerges out of an oral history, and also talk about how oral histories and exhibiting oral histories play a role in a field like architecture, which is inherently so visual. You cannot just be listening to people talk about projects without having visuals of project. And this is something I face as a problem day to day in my journey as a podcast host as well, because I'm talking about people's projects, but I'm not able to put together those visuals or present those. So we'll take it as a two-part thing. First is Sanghamitra could talk about her experience in viewing the exhibition, interacting with the exhibition, and then Ishita, if you can talk a little bit about the narrative and the meaning making.
So two things, when and I was telling her this before we started out, that when I walked into the kind of exhibitions that I design, fortunately for me, I get a lot of money to design things. Okay, so I'm usually working with a corporate or someone, an artist or whatever. So there's a lot of budget to work around. So the first thing when I walked in over here, I realized that, all right, this is low budget. You have one room, and I see the start and the end of the exhibition the moment I get it. So obviously, there are preconceived notions. You feel like you're going to go through this exhibition in 5-10 minutes. And this is where I must congratulate Ishita and the team. I think that was very, very deceptive because the moment couple of things happened. There were no visual cues, right, which we discussed the other day. And so, while I knew somewhere that this was about the women and about the architects, I couldn't see that. You see, the title is telling you so, the write-up that you see downstairs is telling you something, but yet when you come to this space, you don't see any of that. You don't see large portraits of these women. In fact, in every little cluster, there is just one picture of the woman in a different context, right? So she doesn't become, she's not screaming out at you, but yet when you're going through the material that she's kept, each time you remember that, oh, this is at the end of the day someone's work. It's reflecting someone's journey. So that's what I thought was interesting, that in spite of the fact that there is AI, there is virtual reality, there's all of this push to make things immersive, interactive, to add jazz and drama to exhibits. This one was so simplistic, and yet, I'm not saying the other format doesn't work or the other format is wrong. Each has its own takeaway, and I loved the takeaway that I had from this particular exhibition. So in terms of treatment, that's where I would congratulate you. It was great that you left it simple, because then it left the visitor to interact with each exhibit, the content in their own way. Nothing was spoon-fed, nothing was predetermined. In terms of the content, yes, going back to this is an oral history project. Obviously what you see downstairs is about 75-80% focus on exhibits. And the oral history is the framework or the backbone of the project, but this is the first showcase. And to tell you honestly, you will have more opportunities where maybe this time round you chose to showcase the exhibits, but the next time you may have more budget, or you may have more screens or more earphones, and you'll be able to put out more audio content. So this is something that I've struggled with always. I work with another oral history archive, and again we only collect, apart from the interviews that we do, we only collect digital photographs and documents. Yet the exhibitions that we have done, we've largely kept it sort of true to oral history. So we have extracts from interviews. Sometimes you can listen to them. Sometimes we've just taken an entire transcript and, on a wall just giving you question, answer. That's something that you consume. But having said that, what I've not been able to do till now, and it's a struggle, and I hope someday I'm able to do it, is to present a life in its entirety. You have to keep so many things in mind. You have to keep, everything from the layering. How much do you want to reveal? How much is it okay with your interviewee to reveal his or her entire life? How much will the audience even take it? Will they stand or sort of immerse with a life for about 35-40 minutes? Because that's how much time you will need. But you need to know these. Sometimes when you're going through a life, you can sort of extract anecdotes, you can extract the dramatic moments, but the sense making that goes behind a life lived is something that you completely lose. So that's something we're all struggling with. But hopefully, in subsequent exhibitions at some point we'll be able to tackle that.
There was really very little effort in terms of meaning making or sense making. I have to accept that. It's not just the funding, it's also the time that we had. And it's also coming back to the volume of the content which we were talking about. So that's something you listen to me talking in the presentation again and again. How do you make sense of something so expansive, something so detailed? That is where narrative building sort of shifts for us. That can narrative building be more participatory? Can it be something where audience has a role to play rather than completely relying on the author / the curator to sort of create the trail, feed it to you there and there. So yes, it was a very conscious choice sort of we made, and I think it's sort of become a way of doing exhibitions. So the series of exhibitions that we've been doing at Curating for Culture, most of them have been built on archives or collection of archives, the act of collecting archives, as well as connecting archival material with oral histories. So when you want that relationship to be formed, should we be forming it or would you rather form it? And I think I'm addressing both of your points over there, that whether it's the simplistic nature that you're appreciating, and thank you, but I don't think in our head it was so simple, because the process of then doing this became very complex for us. Where do we start? Who is the first one? We're neither doing it chronologically, we're neither saying, okay, this architect is very important and this architect is less important. So there is really no barometer for us to go about it. It's then the stories, and that's what I just wanted to arrive at. We have mostly been trying to work with the idea that the data will tell us, the information will tell us. So what happened here, coming to the story of the exhibition, when we were given an opportunity to launch the archive by doing an exhibition, the archivist sort of took over again before the curator, and the archivist said, okay, let's take the project up a level again. We have the oral histories. Why reiterate that? It's an open platform, you can access it. So we went back to the women architects, asked them to re-participate, and we asked them to actually pull out their physical archives. And this was an exercise now between us for 1.5 months. Some of them have a lot of data. They have never organized it or not been able to organize it for both reasons. A, it's too much data, and archiving is a long process, but two, because they don't know why is it important. And second, some of them have not kept their data. They were very honest, even some of them spoke at the launch and the opening. They said, I didn't know that my life would matter. even though they have worked on very important architectural projects, they have been educators for more than 30 years, but they themselves were questioning the self-worth of why such projects are important. And when we stepped into the space to say we're pulling out physical archives, we got into the collection mode and the collecting of the archives, why they were important, but which one will relate to the question about an atelier, to the question about shape-shifting practices, which we wanted to sort of present. So instead of a narrative, what we usually have been working with, I would like to call it a provocation. So when we do any participatory or community-based projects, and over here I see them as a community as well, is to provoke them to think about themselves, about their practice. So we actually provoke them to think about the shape-shifting nature of their practices. So we moved beyond the conversations about the personal and life, which we had already done, and we knew that these oral histories have it in them. And we moved from there and we said, what about your practice should move the audience? And that is why they picked different parts of their lives or different landmark moments of their life. For somebody it was a project, for somebody it was negotiation with the government, for somebody it was being able to do postgraduate studies at the age of 40, leaving behind 2 children in India and going to Australia. And once you had these now landmark moments of somebody's life, the jigsaw puzzle sort of came back that, okay, we can put them next to each other, start talking to each other. One of the things we really wanted to try was also sort of fictionalize the exhibition, because you almost feel when you move from one oral history to one other, you almost feel like, yeah, it could be the same person, but no, something is different about it. So almost like characters changing in a film or in a novel. But that's where we ran out of time or maybe creative breath.
This is when I think I wanted to do a little bit of a thought experiment of sort. And this is because you say a lot of people don't realize there is value in archiving, there's value in recording their stories. And there are a lot of drawbacks in doing oral histories as well. And there's one project that 2 of us worked on at different points, which is Arvind Talati, where you had done one section of oral history and at the other. And a couple of points that overlapped in both of our questions, we saw the respondent answer very differently to the same kind of questions. So one of the things, of course, is because you're doing it in retrospection, the question of human memory, of course, it degenerates over time, holds. And I've been thinking, and this comes from, so Rem Koolhaas wrote a piece on preservation and saying the window of preservation has been decreasing vastly as the ideas of conservation and preservation grow. So earlier, of course, in the colonial period, we were preserving buildings from the 1600, 1400, 1200. 30 years later, you started preserving buildings which are modern, so built 30, 40 years ago. And he says we're not too far away from the time when you are starting to preserve buildings as you're building them. So if I were to translate the same idea into doing oral histories, why can't we think of oral histories as something which is not done retrospectively after a person has lived a certain life, but really think of it as archiving and recording a conscious stream of thought as and when one is practicing. So like we file our invoices for IT and keep them for 7 years, oral histories and archiving became an integral part of a person's practice. Is this something that either of you have thought about in your projects, whether it is in this particular project, family histories, or Sanghamitra with your larger corporate projects?
Would we still call it oral history?
I mean, it's contemporary history.
It is, right?
Yeah.
So now here's the thing. We thought about doing something like this, say when the pandemic struck, right? There was it was changing a lot of things, and very rapidly things were changing, right? So we thought. So on one hand, for instance, I started keeping important newspaper clippings and just maintaining a table of the important commentary. Then we started looking at how people were, when the first lockdown got over, what people were, what they thought was significant from that period and things like that. But of course, then it ran out of steam. Okay, so that we tried it. But I just feel like it should be done, and I think it is being done, but I just don't know whether historians should be doing this. All right, that's one. But more importantly, I think there is memory kind of lingers on. And I think
What memory?
whatever that is. Okay, and I feel that the space of oral history is to come and engage with the form of memory that has been brought up. Let me give you an example. Now this is from one of the projects that, and I think I can talk about it now. I don't know whether all of you have seen the new web series called Jul-Aug that came out a couple of months ago. We'd been told about one of the leads that we were given is that you need to establish the whole Punjabi Sindhi rivalry in the camps. It was there in newspaper archives. It didn't mention communities, but we did come across newspaper clippings, reports about tension, violence in these camps. It was sort of, stated in a way that this was between two different communities that had recently migrated and so on. And so we went back to these camps, where today you have housing colonies, and we asked these people. All right, and we thought they would say, and we asked the Punjabi community, we kept asking them questions about what was it like, when did you know that you would have to move, the typical migration questions, partition related questions, and then we asked them about what was the refugee camp like. Was there this rivalry? Did you feel a sense of getting shortchanged because the Sindhis came in with more money, this, that, and the other? But interviewee after interviewee only said that, no, I don't remember that. Okay, that's not what is important. What is important is we survived. They kept saying that. So while contemporary records are saying a certain thing, you have to also keep this in mind that this is not how they choose to sort of celebrate their own lives or remember. This is not what they want to remember from that event. What they wanted to remember from that move, that horrific experience that they had gone through, was that we survived. We are here today. And, and even now, you can't really destroy us because we'll figure it out. So that's what I'm saying. So that what memory lingers is important, but the oral historian comes in only to assess that. Why has that memory lingered on? What is it and why has it lingered on?
Yeah, I think I would sort of agree with that. And so my answer is yes and no both. So no, because the meaning making and the reinterpretation of something that has happened to you and the interconnections which you make is what defines an oral history, right? So some sense of pastness to it. And why that pastness? Because it allows you to process your emotions. There's a very strong aspect to oral histories which cannot be taken out is the emotional experience. So while you're giving an example of somebody who wants to celebrate survival, Dopal Gas tragedy is a very good example that even till date, they're horrified of what has happened. It's been so many years, and that's what the museum sort of manifests. It's painful, and so does Holocaust Museum. And then it's on the user how they go and engage with architecture. But the idea that you have experienced something, you need time to process that and make meaning out of it and connect it. Having said that, I do agree with the question itself. Something that we have written very recently, yet to get it published, is about the livingness which one wants to archive. Archives are not supposed to be after it's 100 years old and after it's 200 years old, because that's where we are seeing archives become more and more irrelevant to people. The audience is right here. Audience wants to look at what happened 20 years ago or 50 years ago because times are changing so fast. And that is where the exercising of choice becomes very important. Now, whether the choice is being made by oral historian, by the interviewee or the archivist. But the choice making can happen after the content is created. So what I mean to say is, with the field called autoethnography or self-archiving, you could be creating your memoirs. The way you would preserve your documents, you would be creating your sound recordings. You don't need an oral historian for it. That's where the role of the oral historian is sort of very clear and clarified, as you rightly said. Oral historian doesn't need to do it. You are self-archiving it. And when time comes to actually establish it as an accessible content or material or a database, that's where the exercising of choice what's really important. So I might have found everything that happened to me today very important, but 15 days later I might say, no, just these two things in the flight. Just making it on time with the flight was all that was important. So that choice, whoever is exercising it, and that time to be able to reflect and exercise it becomes important after you have done autoethnography.
I think just to add to it, in some other forum, I think there was this other, for a brief while, I remember we flirted with the idea of an oral historian coming in, even though an event has been well documented by journalists or contemporary writers or whatever. At some point of time, the oral historian comes in to do a reassessment of the time gone by. Right, so I think therefore maybe that documentation needs to be done at the time the event is happening, as well as a retrospective one a couple of years later, a generation later. I think because it again kind of helps you understand how is it that we as society are dealing or sense making that particular event.
Another thing I wanted to pull out from the two things you mentioned right now. One is about the audience, and because you also mentioned the Holocaust Museum. So last Diwali, my husband and I, we were traveling through Israel and we went to Yad Vashem. And I very enthusiastically, of course, he was sitting in a corner after an hour, but I went through the whole museum, went through every single oral history which was done and put up there and listened to everything, whereas his attention span was a little lesser, so he walked through. But that's as a space in a museum, that's something that relied heavily on oral histories. People survive talking about their own experiences. In a place like this, in a field like architecture, where women practitioners are recalling instances from their own lifetime, whatever they choose to bring out into this. Something Sanghamitra and I were talking about is the question of audience and how that audience varies, whether it's an audience that's consuming the same information online through the website versus an audience that walks into an exhibition. And even after walking into an exhibition, with majority of the exhibition being physical exhibits, what do we have to say about the audience that actually puts on the headphones and listens to it versus audience that just walks by, probably catches a couple of subtitles, which I think is something you will add later on to the oral history as well. But how does the audience figure into, one, the way the oral histories are presented, whether digital or physical, and two, if there needs to be a change in the process, in the method, in the medium that caters to a certain audience while the project is being prepared for dissemination.
Can you say the last part again? Sorry.
Does the concentration of a particular audience ever become part of how you would design the exhibition or dissemination, or even the way you would record oral histories if you were keeping in mind a certain audience at the end of it?
Definitely not for collecting oral histories. So there, I know archiving is never unbiased, but striving for it is very, very, very critical. Or any form of research. It's not just archiving or oral histories. Any form of research methodology is you usually trained or you have been inculcated with that thought that you are doing it to sort of present a more objective form of content. I wouldn't say research, but research documentation. And then from there, when you take it forward in your research or in the form of a narrative or in the curatorial process, is where your thought about it should picture in. So what I mean to say is, if I don't matter in that process, an audience should not matter as well. It's having said that, what an interviewee expects is, why are you doing this? And for them, whom all will it be open to or accessible to or made available to, sort of does define their answers. So when we write these project intents, when we take their consent, we have usually worked with the idea that we want to address the publics. Of course, it's very complex to address the publics, but we want the participants to be able to be comfortable with the idea that many more kinds of people would want to listen to your stories or look at your physical archives, because if we are not really able to take the conversation outside of the architecture community, then at least personally I don't see merit in a research-based practice that grew out of architecture and design history. And one or two situations, or a little many more of them, with Biome Diaries or with the exhibition, we have got these responses that, oh, I don't relate to architecture, I'm not really into architecture. But this kind of a conversation makes me realize why it's important to me also. And then they were themselves say, हाँ architecture तो सब जगह होता है, हम सब रहते तो हैं इसके अंदर, हमें पता तो होना चाहिए. So it's really this relationship between me and anybody, any historian or a researcher, and the interviewees or the participants, to want to address that goal and that impact. As much as it feels far-fetched, but we are slowly seeing that it's possible. Coming to the previous part of your question, when they were looking at the exhibition, now I have two exhibitions to talk about in my head. So while in Vandalizing the Atelier, it's a very happy situation that there were very few viewers who really put on the headphones. Even with the TVs, I can understand that they didn't engage with the website much because they know that they can save the QR code and they can access the archive later on. But because there were physical archives and there was a real joy of experiencing on being tactile, they really engaged in that rather than listening to the audio recordings or the video recordings. So the ones who even walked by, they saw it as visuals, not even for its content. So I don't know if the caption would have mattered or the subtitle would have mattered. But what I saw now in Delhi, so the moment the audience changes, right? So what Arthshila brings is art, architecture, design, even not students, but even enthusiasts, at least were engaged with the physical stuff. Whereas what happened in Delhi today, until yesterday or today morning, is that there was a lot of excitement in getting to listen to something on TVs and on screen. So what I'm referring to over here is it's going to be very difficult to sort of pinpoint and say this is how your audience will respond. Because we thought even these 5 TVs would be very exciting. That instead of just putting in the physical material, you're also showing us. We actually edited some of the videos and we gave them the nature that we gave them. We thought, okay, we should have mixed media. But the space and the kind of audience responded very differently. Whereas, as I said, in Delhi, there was a lot of excitement around getting to listen to and putting a face to the name, along with looking at the physical archive. So there were audiences who looked at the TV first for some reason, and then they asked, "Acha, iske bare mein janna hai to," and then we showed them the posters. So now whether it's the scale also, which must have affected, but also the audience was very different. Because it's Delhi, it's Pragati Maidan, it's open to everybody, and they have a lot more to see. So the time span required was very different. So coming to kinds of exhibition like Vandalizing the Atelier, or we have done this in the Cloakroom Archive, we have had audiences who come back. They know there is time, we'll come back, we'll listen to it again, we'll read the archives again, we'll make more notes. The moment you knew you had only 2 days in Delhi, you wanted to get as much as possible. So these are the 2 immediate ways of engagement that I've seen. And for me, that's why it's a spectrum. So I don't want to target anybody and try and address the spectrum as much as possible.
No, it's true. If you're just archiving and all you've been asked to do is document, there's so much more freedom you have, right? You can structure the project, you can structure the questions, the conversation the way you want. The moment you have to do the storytelling with the content that you have, you are doctoring things. There are no 2 ways about it. But the point is, you've just been fed so much. And again, you're going to speak to a wider audience. You're not going to speak to the 10 or 12 people who understand the nuance of oral history or the subject, and they are going to come. And you want more people. You want more footfall, you want more people to come and engage with the exhibition, so you're going to dumb it down a little bit. So everything from keep a clipping, an audio clip down to 30 seconds, or substantiate the clipping with, add a few pictures. Also, then keep in mind, somebody may have spoken about a very, very important aspect, phase in their lives, episode or whatever, but the delivery isn't good. and you know there is something falling short in the delivery, or the accent is improper, and you have to deal with it. All of these are technical problems that you have to deal with once you are curating the exhibition. Then you have to figure out the story is nice. You can't use the video, you can't use the audio because the framing mein gadbad ho gaya, or it's, the gentleman is very old and has not been able to speak properly. Then you have to figure out what to do. You will have to paraphrase what he says and put it in a quote along with a photograph. So these are things that you're constantly doing. But at the end of the day, you're doing it so that more number of people, it resonates. The content resonates with more number of people. Right? You're simplifying your own experience in a way that others can also sort of benefit from it. And then, of course, the archive is open. If there's something that they've enjoyed, or if there's a life that they want to sort of read about more, they can always come back to the archive. But there's a problem that you have with the audience, and then you also have a problem with the interviewees. So, for instance, we had this one interviewee who did not want his the anecdote that we had used from his interview to be presented you write to them, you tell them there's stuff that you're taking from each one's interview, please come for the exhibition, invite them, this, that, and the other. They come for the exhibition and then they say, I don't want you to put this out. I am a Paramveer Chakra body. I want you to put that story out. But at that point, the curator has decided that there is a certain narrative, and him getting the Paramveer Chakra is not fitting into that. So then you have to, these are things that you deal with when you're doing the storytelling, when you're doing the curation.
I think I want to add to this because I realize something is missing in the presentation. We have chosen to not over-edit the audios. And this is, so thinking about, not really thinking about the audience base, but more thinking about how research would happen or should happen. And this is personal experience, perhaps, that I would have wanted to know where an oral history was done. And we have come across both participants describing it, or sometimes me as an interviewer or other interviewers have actually shared the situation that's sort of been created while conducting the oral history. And that is very, as much important as an old incident in their lives, because of which they are saying something. Right? So in the oral histories, a lot of it, at least I feel, and that's left for research, a lot of it that they've said is very responsive to having lived through COVID. So not just the immediate context, but also COVID. So when one understands the context is so important to how we think about lives, how we think about what becomes history. We have usually chosen not to over-edit any of the content. So when you listen to the oral histories, there is the birds chirping and there is the traffic next door. We have
dog barking.
Yes, we have not reduced it because in Chitra's house, Belle plays a very important role, and she barks and she defines how Chitra feels about the house, or she remembers something. Why should we remove it? We've just reduced the volume, or we've paused the conversation, and then we have continued. So when it comes to the exhibition, we have continued this kind of an approach. So even with the videos that you would see down there, or any other exhibition, we have usually kept the content as much as possible unedited. We have also requested again the interviewees for the same. If they have really got some political concerns about things that they have said, we have tried to discuss it out. We have put time limits to it that we can release it later on, but not remove it because things have to be said. They're as important as saving of the context into the content. So yeah, doctoring to what level, but not for whom, but really for the content itself. So for us, constantly the content and the data really becomes the protagonist than anybody else. Neither the curator, nor the researcher, nor the interviewee.
I guess I asked that question very selfishly because as a podcast host, I'm not doing any research or collecting oral histories, but I'm extremely geared towards the audience, which I till date still don't know who listens to it. I know people do, but there's no way to have any feedback loop. So I was just wondering about that feedback loop, in terms of like putting it out there. Is there any way we can generate a feedback loop on just how it could be done and potentially reflect on the methodology? In the interest of time, I have one large thing which is very speculative in nature. So usually I've worked at an archive here, and I've worked in an institutional archive in the US. And of course, in the US, the archive doesn't necessarily get put out as an exhibition. The archive lives as a collection in a cold storage somewhere, and you retrieve the boxes when a person needs to finish their PhD dissertation, usually. And they loan stuff for exhibitions here and there. And so when you're looking at oral histories as part of larger archives, beyond their role as searching aids material for people's PhD dissertations, I was just thinking about how, especially this particular oral history, and should it become an archive in itself, can be used as a way to, this being a continuous project where you collect more oral histories, more archives, and you spoke about that a little bit, but also figure into tapping and tracing how demographics in the architectural profession have changed over time, how women practitioners' attitudes and sensibilities have changed over time, and should I be as passionate and probably dreamy a little bit, how it can also play some kind of a role in policy making, whether it's at the stage of writing policy through Council of Architecture, whether it ends up being, a chapter in like IIA or something. But how do we really look at all this rich data that has been collected rather than reinventing the wheel, look at people's personal lives, experiences, and act upon it in some way? What could that some way look like, both in terms of the projects you've both worked on, but specifically this project?
So now, oral history is usually a tool that I use along with all other research methodologies that we typically employ. Now, what happens is what we've realized is that these interviews, whereas there is no, it's purpose agnostic. So you're just going out there, doing the interviews, having a conversation, and tapping into someone's memory, and you let the conversation sort of flow. We've used oral histories. We've used these recordings rather in the archives that we've set up. Sometimes they've been used for fiction writing. Sometimes they've been used for sort of just non-fiction writing as well. Somebody was writing a book on the history of brands in India, and she looked into the oral recordings to figure out what were these products that people are talking about from the 40s and 50s and so on. So it's been used like that. But I think the strongest argument for oral history typically comes through when you're talking about institutional or corporate archiving. Because again, you have to understand that in institutions and businesses, the records that survive are annual reports and very, 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 very financial related records, right? Financials or correspondence to a certain extent and things like that. Nobody really, by just going through that particular archive, you don't get a sense of how the institution has sort of negotiated with its context through time. That's something you only get through oral history interviews. And I've realized that anyone, whether it's usually if somebody from the corporate or from the business is part of these oral history discussions, it's far more sort of gratifying for them than it is for even me, right? Because there's suddenly the connect is deeper. So I think for any organization that introspection is something that oral history is able to provide. This whole process is able to provide. Of course, then it's left to the archiving department is to understand how to take advantage of all of this, right? Whether you make films out of it, or whether you do a regular internal podcast of all of these recordings, or you do these training videos. I remember we've done this one project for a Delhi-based transport company where they wanted us to do only interviews. And at the end of our project, they wanted us to create 10 different training videos. All right, something that would get put up on their HR portal. We identified what were these 10 things that were critical to values and ethos, that was critical to the organization, and through anecdotes, through episodes, through quotes, we traced how, say, something like customer relations or customer service is something that has been dear to the company right from the time it started, its founder, what he believed in, to how it is institutionalized today. So those are the ways in which you're using oral history in various ways. But I'm sure, I think, there's a lot more that can be done.
I have two very straight examples because I'm just shifting gears here because with personal archiving and family archiving, the kind of work that we have been able to pull off right now in the last few years, this is what sort of took us to talking to Ministry of Culture, and they have sort of offered that we should work on policies using archives and oral history. So I have constantly believed that while got into archiving and oral histories and what curation means to me, Shudha had asked us during the fellowship. And I said, I want curation to be a space of deliberation and discussions and hopefully impact making, rather than just be a place of seeing and walking away. So we are hopeful. And in that sense, I wouldn't be surprised that now with this kind of a project, and if we were in conversation with COA, could we at least initiate conversations rather than just have committees after committees about women representation at COA or at IIA. So the example which you gave is something I have to act on. I have to actually give an essay in IIA journal about it. And one would want to hope that any essay or a research piece is not only about describing these projects. Of course, at some point we want to grow the project, but also making some change institutionally, as you're rightly saying, and actually see impact on ground. Now, the slippery slope here is you are interpreting somebody else's story for a different purpose. So until this point, the part that we have told the interviewee or the participants that it's used for knowledge production, it's used for scholarship of different kinds. So we have already built a spectrum. But if you're going to reinterpret it into building of cities, making new policies, I do feel over there a re-conversation or a re-initiation of conversation is much important. I would imagine if they're around, they also be there on the table rather than disconnecting them from the process of participation and interpretation. Because that would be a very difficult space to be in, because this is where what oral histories do becomes very important. I said this today, but 15 days later, even this bit of history for me might change. That's how living it is. So if I said something, you're going to use it and say, okay, let's change the scene of curation. That's not fair on me. So even for this exhibition or anywhere else, this re-initiating or recycling of consent taking, or at least letting your participants know, is as much important to process of documentation and dissemination as much as doing it at the start of the project. So you're building new outcomes and you continue the conversation, and that's how the relationship keeps growing. And they can choose to then say, don't use it or don't infer such things out of it. Which should, that agency they should have if they're around. If they're around. Oh, agency of the dead is a different question altogether.
I think with that, we'll open it up to anybody who has any questions, observations, notes, thoughts, reflections. And if not, I think we'll conclude.
We'll give it a minute to see.
We'll give it a minute, or we can just loiter around, and if you want to do it more informally, we can.
Yeah, over chai. Let's try. Yes.
I had a question for all three of you. On an acquisition. I'm not an academic, so I might be wrong.
That's right.
It's alright, I talk loudly. What the first one was to you is, when you're looking at in the presentation, there's something mentioned about women creating space. Now, going further into this archiving, do you think we'll stay just within architects or expand into women creating space?
Yes.
Women involved in creating.
Definitely. So what I said there, I know it was a very slow presentation. What I said there was the whole idea of what does it mean to create spaces. So it's not necessarily just architectural spaces, first of all. So that is why even within this project, we've spoken to architects, but also researchers, historians, curators, educators, because you are creating different kinds of spaces, right? So what is now creation of space itself is open, because we wanted to speak with designers as well. So even, I would imagine furniture is a space that you create. So how much do we want to expand and keep growing the scope of it? It depends on the resources and the people who come on board. But the idea was not to limit it to only understanding architecture through its ABC. That's definitely clear that the idea is to...
The maker, the worker,
Yes.
also get.
Oh yes, definitely. So not only, so what I said in that part of the presentation was, we have identified there were women working with women who have not really climbed up the ladder or who have left and made their own practices. So that's a very interesting digression to look at. There are also women who have been very important office managers. So one of them in the exhibition also and in the oral history recording is Tara Chandavarkar. Now the fact that Mr. Chandavarkar has passed away so early on, it's an important practice. A non-architect woman takes the legacy forward and there's hardly any conversation about it. I would imagine just one whole scholarship around this, what does it mean? I remember Monica Correa saying the same thing, that yeah, Correa did what he did, but I managed the office and she's herself an esteemed artist. So these are very important intersections to dwell into, and then going all the way deeper into women on construction sites or women in other roles, which I still may not even be visualizing when I'm putting this out there. So yes, all forms of gender intersections with creation of spaces, hopefully.
So I'll just ask them one after the other. You said something about dumbing down an archive. Now, isn't the whole purpose of an archive for it to be as unbiased as possible?
The archive, yes.
Yeah. But then when you are representing it, or in whatever context, by dumbing it down, isn't it going against the grain of an archive?
I wish it was that simple. But when you're doing a show, there are other considerations you have to keep in mind. What is the purpose of the show? Why are you doing an exhibition?
Okay.
Who is funding the exhibition?
She can have a conversation with them.
Right? So
the
the purpose becomes very important. And then again, the audience, like I said. Who am I doing this for? I'm spending 20 lakhs on an exhibition. If I have 10 people, someone's going to skim me.
Yeah, but if it goes against the basic
There is an archive for
truth
that.
of what something is.
There is an archive.
Yeah, sorry.
Right? So this becomes a window, it becomes a teaser for you to come in and then navigate through the archive on your own. So which is why I'm saying we are very conscious that it is doctored. It is doctored. But unless I put on, and our interviews go on for about 2 to 3 hours. Unless I'm putting on, even if I can put in the money, I'm not going to be able to get the funding to put out 10 systems with that kind of storage, that kind of electricity and equipment to be able to cater to, say, about roughly 25 to 30 people. 30 people coming in every day, you'd say, chalo, exhibition is going well. Right? 10 people, you're not doing something, social media is not helping you. Right? But 25, 30 people is fine. But to be able to create an infrastructure for 30 people to come in and listen to every interview, which is 3 hours long, the back end is backbreaking. So these things you have to keep in mind and figure out what is the best way. Come back to, we do this all the time in creative applications, purpose kya hai? Why are you doing this? What is your budget? What can you do with this budget? Always that. Sorry, I'm very practical about these things.
This is actually the last question. I'll pass it on to whoever. Would you say Instagramming is self-archive?
Yeah, I think so. But I think Instagram is a curated archive. It's not an unbiased archive because you choose to show only parts of your work or yourself that you want to put out the world. In that sense, you're withholding everything you don't want to. Whereas in case you're doing an oral history, I think in some sense, when somebody asks you a question, the interviewer might be unbiased, but the interviewer will still curate what parts of their life they let out. So I think Instagram is extremely highly curated.
But what about those pages such as, houses of
What about blogging? Someone who's keeping an archive doing how they spend their whole day, and they are blogging it out and putting it out. And it's fine. I think.
It's for the recording.
Okay.
That's right.
So I'm saying कि someone who is doing a vlogging every day, putting out his work or whatever they are practicing. So that where does it fall? Since you said Instagramming is something which is curated, and blogging is completely someone who is like showing what they are doing whole day without even making a editing or cut. So then what?
I think there are varying degrees, right? Even while vlogging, people still choose to show only the happy parts of it or whatever they do. Of course, there is now the whole movement of showing things as they are and being completely true to your emotion, this and that. But there's a reason why most people just smile at a picture until it's scanned it and then it is very like your real emotion comes out. But I think even in that extent, if you're choosing to put out something, there's a reason why you're putting only that out, not everything else. I think there's still maybe a lesser degree of curation, but I think it's still curated and specifically chosen for an audience, especially in vlogging.
I think there's a difference between content for archives and archiving.
Yeah.
Videos, blogs, photographs, edited photographs, documents, these are all content for archiving. An archive is more than that. Okay? So, and I think so there is this content for archiving, there's documentation, and then there's archive. Because archiving does need you to think about usage, usability, longevity. You're reproducing, you're creating records, managing it, creating a searchable database. So purpose of an archive really lies in the fact of its usability and search. If you're creating vlogs, you're thinking about that, you're creating a platform for it, yes, then your blogs did become, or your curated content or your Instagram did become an archive. But right now, Instagram, I can't search except for a few hashtags. And that's what stops it from right now becoming an archive. Now, if I'm interested in somebody's archive 20 years later, I am going to tap into their Instagram account, or they would sort of open it up. So there's a very strong line between content for archiving and an archive itself.
If I were being judgy about blogs, then I wouldn't be reading someone's diary from 1920s. It's as simple as that.
It's the same.
As archivists, we're struggling with how to archive digital content, how to archive web pages, again, storage, right? All of that comes into play because the content that gets created on a daily basis today is what archivists are scared shit about. How is one going to archive this? And it's not easy to go through digital content. It's much easier to go through 500 files like this, than go through 5 TB of PDFs and JPEGs and things like that. So that's a nightmare. But vlogging, I mean, I have myself gone back to Reddit accounts and things like that from the early 2000s because we're doing tech history as well, just to understand what do people remember about the first computer games that they played. And somebody has talked about it, very romantically and things like that. So yes, we're using it for archiving. How it's being archived, or rather, we acknowledge the fact that it is important content because it's descriptive.
Yeah.
Instagram, we don't know how descriptive it is, and that, I mean, we're
Very
still
short.
trying to figure out, but I don't think, maybe it will evolve into something, but I do enjoy, like I was saying, I do enjoy all of those pages, Houses of Kerala, and Art Deco this, and Art Deco that, and I love those because at least there is someone's documenting it, someone's putting it out there. Someday when I need to research, I know I'll find it there. Yes, as professional archivists, we've worried about where is retrievability, where is searchability, where is what happens 15 years later, what happens if Elon Musk buys Instagram, then what do we do? All of that are things we are all worried about, but right now, it's an important social commentary that we do acknowledge at some point of time we have to deal with.
Yeah.
Thanks for this. So I think one of the people you interviewed was a man on behalf of. Can you tell us a bit about that and the challenges? Was it very straightforward, or how did you think through that particular project?
That's a very good question. So there are two men. There are many, but right now I'm telling you about two. So we spoke with Tanu Sankalya, who is the son of architect Hema Sankalya. So she's one of the only first generation women architects whom we have been able to interview about. it wasn't so difficult because, as I said earlier in the presentation, Hema Sankar's collection came to Sept Archives while I was setting it up, so there was a relationship. There was also clarity of narrative from the interviewee that there was complaint about the mother not getting her due and limelight and recognition and projects and so on and so forth. But still, Tanu was able to give us a very honest spiel as much as possible and then open up his biases.
But
Yes.
sorry.
Yes.
Also, he's an architect.
Yes, of course.
So that also adds to the.
Yes, that context also adds to it, definitely. Both of them. So the second case is Prem Chandavarkar, and that's why I'm putting them as examples who is speaking about Tara Chandavarkar, again an architect, rightly Vaishnavi pointed out. He also wants to do this, but because you have taken over the office and there have been difference of approaches, there's a very limited account that you end up sharing. So even before I could go to somebody else and say, why haven't we spoken about Tara Chandavarkar, the conversation with Prem, as Prem is also otherwise, he is somebody who speaks quite limited, but otherwise also, if the relationship comes out and that, I don't think it felt like a challenge, but it does feel like, oh, there's more to tap into. So those are oral histories, either ways, they are incomplete. Because one knows that they are biased perspectives, whether it's a shorter version or an elongated version. There are more people one needs to speak with. And both of them have told us who are the other members who can tell us more about it. I don't think Prem mentioned this so much, but Tanu at some point does mention that, yes, when you're asking about gender, I can't speak much about what my mother would have felt in this situation. So he is very cognizant of the fact that because the archive was about gender representation, he clarified when he needed to, because I'm a man, but I've seen my mother go through this. I don't know how she would have felt about it. Yes.
So I'm just curious, did you come across any strong women clients who shaped the journeys of these women architects?
Oh, very good question. Strong women architect. No, that's actually, yeah. So they all kept saying the same thing. They said we didn't know about Ravina Mehta, Yuli Chaudhary when we were studying. So for them, who shaped their lives remains.
In terms of clients, who the clients they were working with?
Clients. I mean, right now again, it's just Chitra comes to my mind, maybe because there's been a more extensive effort in terms of doing the book Biome Diaries. She refers to a lot of clients. Lot of women clients. So one of the examples I can right now give you is Dr. Prabha Chandra, who's a psychologist, one of the clients, husband, wife, for whom they have made the house. It's so ingrained in her experience that she continues talking with her. Prabha also keeps talking about the house changing forms. It's a 20-year-old, 15-year-old project. To the extent that Prabha, in spite of being very busy during COVID times, actually writes an essay into the book. That I must tell my end of the story, even though we have interviewed her. But she felt the need to write about the architecture in her own words. And it is much more psychoanalytical than architecture. So that's one example. Another good example would be between Renu Sehgal, Balwinder Saini, Madhusari. Madhusari is the senior person. So for them, it is about looking up to Yuli Chaudhary or about looking up to Madhusari. Also not doing some of the things that Yuli Chaudhary did, which come out in the conversation. So, because they're all taking over each other's positions as chief architect, and then what not to do, what to do, times are changing. So they do make these references of role models, not so proclaimed role models, but sort of affects their decision making and their lives.
Thank you, Sanghamitra and Vaishnavi, for this insightful discussion. And thank you all for joining us today. As Ishika already mentioned, if you have any more questions or queries or thoughts to share, there is tea and coffee available downstairs at this cafeteria. So yeah, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.